Hello, everybody. Welcome back. So we're continuing this idea of community ecology and food webs and interactions between communities or populations. And critically, we've landed in this idea of competing for resources. And ultimately, this is what drives a lot of community ecology, is understanding how and where populations exist, how those ecological niches might overlap, and how ultimately they might that might influence the overall population health. So, for example, your book gives the example of the honeybee. So, for honeybees, actually, they have a very broad ecological niche. So they're really pollinating lots and lots of different types of flowers and are able to do so. Other pollinators are not as prolific, and because of their size, are unable to pollinate a lot of plants in which the honeybee is essentially the primary pollinator in the system. Again, sort of highlighting why honeybees are such an important species. So thinking a little bit more specifically about this competition for resources in a very strictly ecological sense only happens when niches overlap. So when one or two species rely on the same pool of limited resources, and that again is resulting in competition. Now, a critical principle in ecology is called the competitive exclusion principle. And that basically says if one of the competing species is driven to extinction because essentially they are more fit and more able to survive in that niche and were more effective competitors. So we can actually look at this in terms of a laboratory example. So if we're plating on a petri dish Peorelia alone, we can see that it grows almost again in that exponential to logarithmic change. Same with P. caudatum alone. Again, so this is highlighting that both of these species are able to survive in this particular niche. However, when they're grown together, you can see that the Peorelia outcompetes the P. caudatum. Again, so this is sort of highlighting visually the competitive exclusion principle. Now, oftentimes this doesn't happen in nature because we don't have these closed systems. And different species are able to migrate to different areas, but it's something to always sort of keep in mind that in exclusion, in where competition alone is your primary dynamic force between two species, ultimately we can sort of think about this competitive exclusion principle in which one species will drive another to the point of extinction. So that is boosting us into this idea of symbiotic relationships. So this brings us to symbiotic relationships. Sym meaning together, biotic meaning way of living. So again, we have together living essentially. So there are several ways in which ecologists talk about symbiosis. And the primary ones are going to be parasitism, mutualism, and commensalism. And these are all different ways of describing how two populations work together in terms of resources. So the first type of relationship we're going to talk about is parasitism. Now you've probably heard about maybe all of these, but this one is really in which one of the pairs of the members of the symbiotic relationship is benefiting at the expense of the other. So the example in your book that's given for parasitism is the varroa mite on honeybee populations. So it parasitizes both the larvae and the adult bees, and it obtains nutrition and leaves the bees with an impressed immune system. So again, one creature is benefiting while the other is having its resources taken away. Now, some forms of parasitism can actually be quite large. So a lot of times when we're thinking about parasites, we're thinking about small bugs um, or other critters that are microscopic. But in some cases, parasites can actually be quite large. So this is a parasite that infects fish, and it goes in and actually eats the tongue out of the fish and continues to eat the nutrients that the fish is attempting to consume. On the other end of parasitism, we have parasites that can be quite small or near toward the cellular level. So this is a parasite called Trypanosoma cruzi, and this is the causative agent of a disease called Chagas disease, which is prevalent in parts of South America. And this is what those parasites look like swimming amongst red blood cells. So again, parasitism is simply a way to describe how two communities are living together, and ultimately one species is benefiting while the other species is having some sort of detrimental cost to living in symbiosis with the other organism. Another type of symbiotic relationship on the other end of the spectrum is mutualism, and this is where both species benefit from one another. So moving on to different types of symbiotic relationships, we have the other end of the spectrum, which is mutualism. So this is a symbiotic relationship in which both members benefit. So the example that's given in your book is looking at the relationship between pollination and bees. So bees use the nectar from flowers to create its food source, and in response, the flowers result in pollination. But you can think of mutualism even on a microscopic level. Again, it doesn't really matter the size of the organism. What matters is the identity of the interaction between these organisms. So in the bee gut, there's mutualistic bacteria that survive off of the nutrients that the bee ingests, and in turn, these bacteria can provide protection against pathogens for the bee. So, a lot of research today is looking at the gut microbiota and how that influences health in humans. And that's an example of a mutualistic symbiotic relationship. Again, it doesn't matter the size. So, like, for example, we can look at this idea of ostracods living within the algae. So the ostracods take care of the algae and get rid of parasites that might infect the algae, and in turn, the ostracods are able to use the algae as its primary home and environment. And again, we can think about other types of pollination. We can think about how birds and mistletoe might interact, for example. So mistletoe creates berries that the birds then can feed, and it confers the advantage of being pollinated by the birds, and the birds confer nutrients from the mistletoe. Again, what matters is not how big or how small an interaction is. It's ultimately the energy flow and whether or not an organism is benefiting from the relationship or not. The last type of relationship we're going to talk about is commensalism, in which one partner benefits and the other is completely unharmed. So the example that's given to you in your book is that bees live in the hollows of trees. The bees benefit from the shelter of the trees. However, these nests don't bother the trees at all. Another example that is brought up a lot is birds or small fish that feed off the parasites of larger, in this case, a whale shark. And they are able to confer the benefit of having. So previously, we had relationships in which one member confers advantage, and ultimately they both confer some sort of advantage. So, for example, whale sharks and these small species of fish. The small species of fish feed off of the whale shark. The whale shark gets parasites removed from its skin. But there are also other fish that exclusively just feed off of the dead slough of the shark. And while the shark would shed this naturally, it doesn't harm the shark at all to have it picked off by these fish. So this is an example of sort of both of those dynamics happening simultaneously. Another example of a species using trees as its commensal host is lichen. So lichen spread on tree trunks and survive off the nutrients it produces, but it doesn't harm the tree at all in any way. So in summary, in thinking about community ecology, the first part we want to talk about is that community ecology is made up of different interacting species. And those organisms in a community are connected by food chains or food webs. And ultimately, when we're describing the interactions between these species, organisms can have different types of symbiotic relationships. And those are the ones that we just went through. Ultimately, the space and resources, including other members of the community that a species uses to survive and reproduce, define a species' ecological niche. All right, so that concludes our talk about community ecology, and I will see you next week for Module 3.